By the time anyone realized the new nurse was the only person in the room who truly understood what was happening, the monitor had already begun its thin, vicious scream. The patient on bed 3 had gone from pale to gray in less than 10 seconds. Somewhere behind the nurse's station, a cup struck the tile. Voices rose in fragments, searching for a doctor, for respiratory, for someone with authority. At the center of that widening panic stood the woman they had spent 2 weeks dismissing as too quiet, too slow to speak, too careful to belong in a trauma hospital that worshipped speed. Lena Mercer did not raise her voice. She placed one hand on the patient's shoulder and the other near the line feeding into his arm, then looked once at the pump, once at the chart, and moved with a speed so precise it almost failed to register as speed at all. She stopped the infusion, shifted the oxygen mask, and let her eyes travel from the patient's mouth to the rise of his chest to the monitor and back again. She understood immediately that the problem was not in the lungs, that the wrong line had been engaged, and that he needed support before the room had even agreed on the shape of the emergency. While a resident still struggled to understand what she meant, Lena was already in motion, already making the first decisions that would matter. The room was bright with overhead light and thick with the smell of antiseptic, printer toner, and fear. Around her stood educated people with titles, reputations, and expensive confidence, yet they were still trying to define the crisis while she was already inside it, already solving it. Then Dr. Malcolm Thorne arrived, cutting through the crowd with anger on his face and authority in his stride. He came ready to take over, ready to assign blame, ready to remind everyone whose floor this effectively was after midnight. He opened his mouth to give an order, but Lena gave one first. She did not shout, and she did not perform. She simply spoke with a clean certainty that sounded older than the building. By the time the crash team reached the room, the patient had air moving again, a pulse the staff could trust, and one terrified resident staring at Lena as if he had just watched a locked door open by itself. What unsettled the people who had underestimated her was not merely that she had been right. It was that she had been right immediately. Half an hour later, before the paperwork began, and before blame hardened into the usual whispered politics moving through Harbor Point Medical Center, a man in civilian clothes stepped off a secure elevator onto the surgical floor. His left arm rested in a sling, and old discipline still showed in the way he scanned the room. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and carried pain like a private inconvenience. No one recognized him at first except security, who straightened without meaning to. He said almost nothing. He looked once through the glass into bed 3, once toward the nurse's station, and then his gaze settled on Lena Mercer as she peeled off a pair of gloves. She did not look up, but something in the angle of her shoulders changed. The man moved closer, careful and restrained, as if unwilling to interrupt what he did not yet understand. When she finally turned, recognition crossed his face in layers, disbelief, memory, and something heavier than both. He leaned toward her with a kind of reverence and said her old call sign so quietly that only the nearest people could have heard it. In that small moment, another life entered the room without explanation. Lena Mercer had been at Harbor Point for 12 shifts. 12 shifts was enough time for a hospital to decide what kind of person you were. Officially, there were orientation modules, preceptors, badge permissions, polite emails, and policy binders. In practice, the real verdict came faster. It arrived in glances over coffee lids, in whether anyone saved you a seat while charting, in whether attending physicians looked at you when you gave report or looked through you. Harbor Point stood on the edge of San Diego Bay like it had been designed to impress helicopters. Its glass frontage and steel frame housed private donor wings on one side and emergency intake on the other, with enough military contract traffic moving through to give the place a constant undertone of compressed urgency. It was not fully civilian and not fully federal. It was the kind of hospital where prestige and triage shared hallways and quietly resented each other. The night shift on 3 South functioned as a kingdom ruled by competence, hierarchy, and insecurity in that order, and Dr. Malcolm Thorne understood all three. He was 38, sharply handsome in the polished way expensive grooming sometimes imitates character, and very good at being the smartest person in a room as long as the room agreed to the premise. He was trauma-trained, donor-friendly, efficient, charming when cameras were nearby, and exactly the kind of physician a hospital liked to display. He brought in money, saved difficult cases, and knew how to speak to board members as if he belonged among them. The problem was that he treated disagreement as disrespect, questions as sabotage, and nurses as useful until they became visible. People forgave him for it because he was usually right. They feared him because when he was wrong, someone else paid first. Lena had arrived on his floor in fresh navy scrubs with a new badge and the expression of someone who had long ago learned how to read a room before anyone spoke. She was not loud, not eager to impress, not interested in filling silence with harmless chatter. Her file noted that she had completed her RN bridge program with honors, worked in expeditionary medicine overseas, and then spent a year in a veterans rehabilitation clinic outside Coronado. That phrase, expeditionary medicine overseas, created more rumor than clarity. Some assumed it meant NGO work, others guessed travel nursing with theatrical branding, and a few speculated she had washed out of somewhere no one wanted to name. Lena never corrected anyone. That irritated people first. The second thing that unsettled them was that she seemed to notice everything. She noticed which supply cabinet always stuck, and which staff member kicked it instead of filing a repair request. She noticed which patient rooms lost signal in the far corner when too many devices shared one strip. She noticed when an intern documented normal breathing on a patient whose shoulders were already telling a different story. She noticed the difference between panic and urgency, between noise and danger, between doctors who needed help and doctors who needed an audience. Because she noticed, she adjusted, always quietly and always before anyone asked. Some people found that deeply helpful, others found it threatening. Her preceptor, a veteran ICU nurse named Tessa Alvarez, liked her almost immediately, though she would not have admitted it so early. Tessa believed that affection in hospitals should be distributed carefully, like narcotics, with timing and discipline. Still, she saw in Lena something unusual. Lena moved like someone who had done the work in harsher places and under worse lighting. She answered questions cleanly and gave almost nothing away. The nearly smiles she allowed from time to time suggested wit beneath the reserve, a dry and possibly dangerous one, but she never spent it cheaply. There were clues for anyone who knew how to look. The black watch on her wrist remained set to 24-hour time. The duffel she carried had once held a patch that had been removed so carefully its outline still showed if the light hit it right. She folded trauma shears into her pocket with a muscle memory that looked drilled rather than taught. When helicopters passed overhead toward the roof, other new hires looked up in curiosity, but Lena checked the wall clock, the corridor route to the elevator, and the trauma supply board. She did not react like someone startled. She reacted like someone preparing. Once, when a transport orderly dropped a spoon in the break room, she turned at the sound before it hit the tile. People noticed. They just did not understand what they were seeing. Dr. Thorne's dislike of Lena began in the small way these things often do, when one person senses another person's competence before he can categorize it. On her fifth shift, he requested a post-operative summary while walking, expecting the usual breathless effort from staff trying to keep up. Lena matched his pace and gave him the patient's numbers, current complaint, medication response, and one quietly flagged concern about delayed swelling near the operative site. Thorne dismissed the swelling as expected. Lena acknowledged that it was, but added that the change in contour was not. He stopped walking. Tessa, 2 steps behind, would later say that was the moment he decided he disliked her. He went to the room himself, identified the complication early, corrected it, and saved the patient from worsening. Yet afterward, in front of 2 residents, he told Lena to phrase concerns as questions rather than conclusions, warning that confidence without seniority could confuse teams. Lena accepted the statement without apology. She did not apologize for being right, and that stayed with him. What followed were the smaller cuts institutions inflict when they want to reduce someone without committing openly to cruelty. Her schedule shifted so her meal breaks vanished first. She got the unstable admissions no one wanted and the donor family rooms no one respected. Residents stopped introducing themselves and instead asked her to handle only the nursing part when she offered observations. One surgeon referred to her as the quiet nurse so often that it replaced her name for an entire week. At Harbor Point, humiliation did not usually arrive as open drama. It came as erosion, her ray. Ports were interrupted. Her suggestions were repeated later in deeper voices and rebranded as leadership. Her calm was interpreted as inexperience because the people around her had spent too long mistaking volume for authority. Lena did not break. She did not cry in the medication room or vent in the locker room. She simply documented, learned the floor, remembered every face, and kept arriving exactly on time. The fact that she did not visibly suffer made certain people even crueler, because visible pain would have reassured them. Tessa pushed back where she could. She corrected staff who used the wrong name for Lena. She made sure Lena got the better portable monitor. Once she stared down a resident until he repeated Lena's report back with thanks included. She understood what the others did not, that Lena's reserve was not emptiness but compression. She also understood that Lena had no intention of giving the floor her autobiography. When Tessa asked gently what expeditionary medicine actually meant, Lena replied only that it involved remote support, mobile units, and long days. When pressed on whether it had been military, she described it as adjacent. That answer only deepened the mystery. Tessa noticed other things, too. Lena wore a plain silver ring on a chain beneath her scrubs instead of on her hand. There was an old healed scar near the base of her wrist. Whenever someone in the break room talked too proudly about hospital chaos, Lena's face went politely blank, the way adults look at children who think rain is the worst storm imaginable because they have not yet seen a sea rise. She had the look of a person who had worked under harsher conditions than Harbor Point could imagine, but who had no need to advertise it. On the 8th shift, Harbor Point hosted a donor event in the atrium below. There were strings of light, rented flowers, polished shoes, and the usual strange contrast between public generosity and private suffering. Upstairs, people fought for consciousness under fluorescent panels. Downstairs, donors sipped sparkling water and praised resilience under soft jazz. The featured guest was Arthur Bell, a construction magnate recovering from an elective cardiac procedure more delicate than the public relations office wanted anyone to notice. Bell wanted a brief appearance to reassure investors. His family wanted photographs. Administration wanted the evening to look effortless. Dr. Thorne wanted credit. Bell was not supposed to leave his room without clearance, but exceptions bloomed easily around wealth. Lena learned that before midnight. A little after 12:30, she found Bell back in bed after his cameo downstairs. He was breathing just slightly too fast beneath expensive sheets. The room smelled faintly of cologne and banquet flowers. There was glitter on the cuff of his visitor's chair. Bell's daughter stood in the corner speaking angrily into her phone about optics. Lena looked at the patient and felt the first quiet knock of trouble. His chart said he was stable. His skin said otherwise. She asked him 2 questions. He answered one and brushed off the second. She checked the line at his arm, then the monitor trend, then the medication pump. Nothing about it seemed catastrophically wrong at first glance. That was exactly the problem. It was almost correct, and that kind of almost can kill a patient while everyone compliments the workflow. Lena called Tessa first, not because she needed permission, but because experienced nurses know to build witnesses before battles. Tessa arrived, took one look, and immediately understood that the patient was trending the wrong way. Bell insisted he was fine, but Lena gently distinguished between being fine and merely being uncomfortable. She asked Bell's daughter when the last medication adjustment had occurred and learned it had happened downstairs, handled by a doctor. Before the daughter even named him, Lena already knew it had been Thorne. He arrived with 2 residents and the posture of a man walking into a room he already considered under control. Lena gave a concise report and referenced the discrepancy, the timing, the patient's presentation, and the reason she believed the deterioration did not match the intended treatment plan. Thorne glanced at the pump and said it remained within range. Lena understood it was within the wrong range, according to a chart revision that had posted after the line had already been hung. One resident shifted uneasily. Bell's daughter looked from one to the other and grew visibly sober. Thorne stepped closer to Lena rather than to the patient and began the sort of quiet professional correction he used when he wanted humiliation to feel instructional. He suggested she was unfamiliar with normal post-operative variation and was escalating a deviation into a crisis she did not understand. Lena remained still and told him it was already escalating. The room fell silent enough to hear Bell swallow. "Th." Orne smiled with the expression of a man preparing to punish someone under the guise of education. He reached for the pump, but Lena's hand got there first. Her stop was not dramatic or aggressive. It was simply final. She told him not to proceed. For half a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the monitor tone sharpened. Bell's breathing worsened. One resident murmured the first quiet sign of panic. In that instant, the emergency that had existed only in Lena's perception became visible to everyone else. What followed happened quickly enough that witnesses would later remember it out of order. A pump was silenced. A line was disconnected. Support equipment was called for. Bell's daughter cried out for her father. A resident fumbled with gloves because adrenaline had turned his hands into theory. Thorne began to issue an order, then stopped because Lena had already identified the underlying problem and was several steps ahead of whatever he had been about to suggest. She repositioned Bell, adjusted support, and directed the room in a voice that remained level even as everyone else's rose. She told one person to call rapid response and stay on the line, another to bring airway support, and even addressed Thorne with a controlled sentence that made it clear that if he wanted the patient stable when help arrived, he needed to assist rather than posture. The phrasing was respectful in form and devastating in implication. Thorne obeyed because once the body on the bed started slipping, ego lost its imaginary authority. Belle's oxygenation dropped, someone cursed, and the resident nearest the doorway nearly ran the wrong direction before Lena corrected him without turning her head. That was the moment everyone truly understood she was not guessing. She had seen the trap before it fully closed. She had recognized the pattern from fragments. In a room full of specialists, she became the calm center around which everyone else reorganized. Rapid response arrived with wheels, equipment, bodies, and noise. The lead physician asked a few clipped questions. Lena answered all of them before Thorne could. She gave sequence, assessment, and response without embellishment or self-defense. The physician checked the pump, checked Belle, and recognized the quality of the catch immediately. Thorne said nothing. Belle stabilized not all at once, but incrementally in the careful way patients do when the cliff edge finally stops collapsing beneath them. It was enough for transfer. It was enough for his daughter to sit suddenly because her knees no longer trusted themselves. As the bed rolled out, Belle caught Lena's sleeve for a weak second and let her know that he understood she had known what was happening before anyone else did. Lena told him only that she had seen enough. He thanked her, frightened in the plain and human way wealthy men rarely permit themselves in front of staff. Then he was gone. The silence afterward felt stranger than the emergency itself. Monitors continued chirping in distant rooms. Shoes squeaked in the corridor. The intercom summoned environmental services elsewhere because the hospital, indifferent beast that it was, had already moved on. But inside Belle's room, those who had watched Lena save a man from a mistake none of them had fully recognized yet were forced to rearrange their understanding of her. One resident asked how she had known. Lena answered with the simple triad of trend, presentation, and timing. He insisted that could not have been enough to know that fast. Lena replied only that it had been enough that night. Thorne's face had gone pale in the dangerous way that suggests exposure rather than illness. Lena did not look triumphant. That unsettled him more than any act of pride could have. If she had gloated, he could have called her insubordinate. If she had lectured, he could have called her reckless. Instead, she returned to work. He was left standing in the wreckage of a moment he could neither control nor reinterpret. As soon as the witness-rich part was over and the patient was gone, Thorne turned on her. He asked what exactly she thought she had been doing. Lena answered that she had prevented further deterioration. He accused her of interfering with an active, physician-directed treatment plan. She corrected him by describing it as interruption of a dangerous mismatch between the treatment plan and the line. He insisted she had no position from which to make that call unilaterally. She answered with the quiet and fatal truth that she already had. Tessa understood immediately that this line would cost them later. Thorne stepped closer and reminded Lena that she was on probationary orientation, that she did not seize control of his room, countermand him in front of family, or touch equipment without instruction when he was present. The resident by the door stared at his shoes. Lena looked at Thorne with a steadiness that was almost merciful and told him plainly that if she had waited for instruction, Belle would have crashed harder. The truth hit the room with enough force that Thorne could not deny it directly, so he shifted toward process and announced that there would be a review. Lena agreed that there should be one. She did not offer apology, deference, or retreat. She signed herself onto the side of truth and let him choose what to do with that. The write-up came before 2 in the morning, and that alone told Tessa everything. No reasonable review begins that fast unless the outcome has already been chosen. The charge nurse called Lena into a glass-walled office where Thorne sat with nurse supervisor Denise Kessler and an administrative representative whose smile looked permanently laminated. Denise was the kind of supervisor who had mistaken polish for ethics somewhere in middle management and never found her way back. She spoke in phrases like team cohesion and patient-facing confidence, protecting the hospital's image first, its high-value physicians second, and nursing staff only when neither of those priorities was inconvenienced. Thorne gave his version first. He described Lena's actions in language so sanitized it almost glowed. He emphasized premature intervention, escalatory communication, and disruption of physician-led stabilization. He did not state directly that she had caused Belle's deterioration. He did something subtler and more damaging. He arranged the timeline so that frightened administrators could imagine it. Lena listened without interrupting. When Denise asked for her account, Lena gave it exactly as she had lived it, brief, specific, and stripped of adjectives where nouns would suffice. She referenced the chart change, the line discrepancy, the observed trend, the patient's response, and the rapid response physician's verbal affirmation that the catch had been valid. The administrator wrote notes that did not look like truth. Denise asked whether there might have been more collaborative ways to raise concern. Tessa, attending as witness, laughed once in disbelief. Denise ignored the implication. Lena replied that she had raised the concern directly and then the patient had worsened. Denise reminded her that the hospital valued composure. Lena answered that she had in fact been composed. Thorne then offered the smug line that composure was not the same as control. Lena answered by agreeing, and the room shifted again, because even the administrator heard what was inside that exchange. Denise made the decision she always made. She protected power. Pending review, Lena was removed from medication administration and physician-critical response involvement for the remainder of orientation. Tessa objected sharply, pointing out the absurdity of sidelining the nurse who had identified the problem while pretending that made sense. Lena stopped her with the lightest touch to the wrist. Then she signed the notice, not because she accepted the lie, but because she intended to survive long enough to outlast it. By sunrise, the floor had already settled on easier versions of the story. Hospitals are quick to turn ambiguity into folklore. Some said the new nurse had overreacted and gotten lucky. Some said she had embarrassed Thorne and was paying for it. Some claimed Bell's family had complained, which was untrue. One resident tried to tell the story accurately in the lounge and was warned by a senior to think carefully about how he characterized attendings if he wanted a fellowship recommendation. Accuracy died the usual small death fear gives it. Lena spent the rest of her shift on modified duty, doing the visible but powerless work institutions assigned to people they want diminished without fully removing. She stalked, observed, and documented. At one point, she pushed a linen cart past two interns who did not realize she was behind them. They referred to her in whispers as the one from Bell's room and described her as the nurse who had grabbed the pump without authorization. Yet even in their gossip, they admitted that Thorne had looked shaken, a thing they thought impossible. Lena kept walking. Later that morning, Denise reassigned her from trauma overflow to discharge coordination, an insult disguised as logistics. A day shift nurse asked whether she was the med error girl. Lena answered only that she was not. When Bell's daughter called asking specifically for the nurse who had saved her father, Denise took the call herself. Lena saw only the annoyance on Denise's face afterward. Even the rapid response physician, when he later passed Lena in the hall and saw the restriction notice clipped to her assignment sheet, understood exactly what had happened and chose not to stop. That silence was its own indictment. Lena should have gone home after that shift, but Harbor Point had a talent for stretching one bad night into a longer one. Shortly after dawn, County Dispatch alerted the hospital to multiple incoming casualties from a maritime training accident off Coronado. It was not spectacular in the cinematic sense, just the ordinary brutality of real emergencies. Cold water, mechanical failure, bad timing, and bodies arriving faster than certainty. Harbor Point shifted into intake mode. Stretchers rolled, trauma rooms opened, security repositioned, and the roof trembled once under rotor wash. Modified duty means little when a hospital suddenly needs every competent hand it has. Denise knew that, Thorne knew that, and Lena knew something else. The rhythm of this sort of event was deeply familiar. It was not the details that struck her, but the cadence. The tight compression before arrival, the clipped reports, the way civilian staff fixated on what could be seen while missing the quieter signs of what was still coming. Without being asked, Lena checked the trauma inventory board, confirmed warm fluids, and repositioned two portable suction units because one bay always lost reach once a gurney blocked the cabinet. No one noticed her doing it. That was fine. Good preparation often looks like simple tidying to people who do not understand consequences. Then the first team came through the doors. Two Navy corpsmen, one rescue swimmer, one semi-conscious patient suffering from impact and immersion, one other patient more awake but hiding pain behind military-grade stubbornness, and behind them, moving with controlled impatience despite the sling on his arm and the salt still drying on his boots, came Commander Owen Cade. He was not in dress uniform and made no dramatic entrance. He wore dark civilian clothes thrown over an undershirt, carried exhaustion behind his eyes, and held authority so naturally in his posture it required no decoration. People near the desk straightened before they understood why. Security understood immediately. So did an administrator who appeared from nowhere wearing concern like a newly pressed jacket. Cade was not the worst injured person in the room, but he was clearly its center of gravity. One corpsman reported on 2 members of Team 7, explaining that one had chest trauma, one had endured prolonged immersion, and the commander had refused transport until both men were loaded. Thorne moved in at once, smelling opportunity. He introduced himself and promised excellent care. Cade gave him a single nod and looked past him, scanning the room with the same unsentimental precision he had shown earlier. His gaze landed on Lena for a brief second and then moved on, but she felt it. It was not recognition yet, only disturbance, the first ripple of memory trying to surface. The more critical of the incoming patients was Chief Petty Officer Aaron Velez, a broad-chested operator whose skin carried the ashy cast of someone losing ground quietly. His initial vitals were messy but not catastrophic, the kind of picture that invites overconfidence in people who have not learned to fear delayed collapse. Thorne took the room himself, naturally. Commander Cade stayed nearby, refusing a chair despite the sling and answering questions in sparse, efficient fragments. Time in water, impact vector, uncertain loss of consciousness, no known allergies, possible hidden inhalation component. He spoke like a man who had delivered bad information under pressure before and knew exactly how much language could be spared. Because of her restriction notice, Lena was assigned to support intake in the adjacent bay. Denise made sure of it and even murmured that Lena should stay in her lane this time. Lena said nothing. Then through the partition, monitors began their rising chatter. Thorne spoke. A respiratory technician adjusted equipment. One resident misheard a corpsman's comment and repeated it incorrectly. Lena looked up sharply. She asked the corpsman to repeat what had been said. He explained that Velez had been trapped under a partial load for approximately 40 seconds before extrication. Lena asked not merely how much water he had aspirated, but what color the cough had been. The corpsman, surprised by the precision of the question, answered that it had first been pinkish and then clearer. Lena was already moving toward the doorway before Denise hissed her name in warning. Inside the bay, Velez's breathing had changed in the subtle way that precedes catastrophe. Not enough to trigger cinematic panic, just enough to kill a person while everyone was still admiring the monitor. Thorne focused on the obvious injury. The resident focused on the machine. The respiratory technician focused on equipment fit. Lena focused on the man. In that instant, every breadcrumb of her hidden training, every old reflex she had kept buried beneath 12 shifts of quiet obedience, rose cleanly to the surface. She warned Thorne that the patient was compensating on borrowed time. He told her to get out. She warned him again that he was about to lose the room. When the resident finally reported that the pressure was slipping, irritation cracked into urgency. Lena asked the corpsman for the L. Asked 3 minutes before transport. He answered instantly, not because she outranked him, but because something in her tone bypassed civilian hierarchy and hit a more practical level of training. He described agitation followed by dangerous calm, coughing, and increasing chest pain during lift. Lena recognized the pattern. Thorne again ordered her away from the patient, but Commander Cade, standing silent at the foot of the bed, watched all of it with deep attention. Lena assessed one thing with her hand, another with her eyes, and made the calculation that defines entire lives in medicine, whether following process would now do more harm than breaking it. Then she crossed the threshold completely. Thorne demanded to know what part of his order had been unclear. Lena ignored the question because function mattered more than wounded authority. She checked Velez, asked the right questions, and shifted the team's focus. The corpsman obeyed her first instruction. The respiratory technician obeyed the second. The resident hesitated on the third until Commander Cade told him in one quiet word to do it. No rank had to be stated. None was needed. What followed was not theatrical but impressive in the way reality often is. It was competence under compression, a rapid reassessment, fast adjustments, and the correction of a dangerous assumption before it became fatal. Velez worsened, but not as badly as he would have if the room had remained focused on the wrong thing. His airway effort changed. The space tightened around the bed. Equipment shifted. Thorne, to his credit, adapted quickly once the real pattern became undeniable. He was arrogant, but he was not stupid. Still, by then he was no longer leading from the front of knowledge. He was following a reality Lena had recognized first, and everyone in the room knew it. Commander Cade knew it most clearly because while the others watched the crisis itself, he was also watching Lena. He watched the economy of her movement, the way she placed herself where impact would come if the patient thrashed, the way she listened to incomplete data as if it were enough, and the way she never performed urgency for effect. Recognition began there, not in her face, but in her muscle memory. When Velas stabilized enough for imaging and further intervention, the room exhaled together. The resident looked ill with adrenaline. The respiratory tech muttered a diplomatic but useless comment about a good catch without saying whose it was. Thorne pulled off his gloves with jerky precision and turned his fury back on Lena, accusing her of disobeying a direct order. She answered that she had prevented a worse event. Unexpectedly, the young corpsman spoke up. He said she had responded before anyone else did and had asked the right questions before the rest of the bay understood what they were seeing. Thorne tried to reclaim ground by reminding everyone that this was a hospital, not a field exercise. Cade answered in a low, level tone that, if anything, a hospital was less forgiving. The sentence landed like a blade laid quietly on a table. No one replied. Lena stepped back the moment the patient no longer needed her, moving to the edge of the room and documenting observed times from memory on a blank note sheet before they blurred. Commander Cade noticed that too. Then his eyes went to her watch, with its 24-hour face and scratched bezel, worn like a tool rather than an accessory. A strange expression crossed his face, not certainty but something near it, enough to make him forget his own pain for a second. Denise arrived just in time to see Lena inside the bay after the save, and for Denise that did not look like usefulness. It looked like violation. She pulled Lena into the corridor and demanded to know whether she had lost her mind. Lena answered simply that the patient had been decompensating. Denise insisted Lena was not the deciding authority. Lena replied that someone had to be. That sentence hit administrative ears like a confession of rebellion. Denise's face chilled, and she demanded Lena's trauma access badge tab. For the first time that night, something close to tiredness crossed Lena's face. Not fear or panic, just exhausted recognition of how small some people become when truth threatens their standing. She unclipped the access tab and placed it in Denise's hand. Tessa arrived just in time to hear the order and openly challenged the absurdity of benching a nurse after 2 successful catches in one night. Denise barked for her to stand down. Then Commander Cade stepped into the hallway. He did not move aggressively or speak loudly. He was simply present, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Denise recognized power, or at least proximity to it, and her tone softened at once. She described the matter as an internal process review. Cade's eyes moved from Denise to Lena to the access tab in Denise's hand. He asked whether that was what this really was. Denise smiled thinly and repeated her explanation. Cade accepted the words with a nod that suggested he was filing them away for later, then asked who the chief nursing officer was that night. When Denise asked why, he answered only that he had asked. It was enough to make her realize she had stepped into water deeper than she could see. Lena was escorted to Conference Room C, a narrow glass box with a table, 4 chairs, and a wall monitor that never worked properly on the first attempt. It overlooked a service corridor and smelled faintly of stale coffee and overused air. She sat without pacing or spiraling. Outside, Harbor Point kept moving in all the ordinary ways that institutions do when they do not care who has just been humiliated inside them. After a while, she began writing down every detail from the night in clean block letters. Names, times, observed statements, equipment positions, sequence, and witness presence. Her handwriting was compact and severe, the sort produced by people who know memory is honest but institutions are not. At 8:11 the door opened and Commander Owen Cade entered alone. Up close he looked older than at a distance, with salt at the temples and a healing bruise above his collar. The sling held his left arm but did nothing to reduce his presence. He closed the door gently, as though he did not trust the room with noise. Lena stood automatically. He told her to sit, but she remained where she was. He looked down at the notes she had made and approved of them with a single word. Then he asked where she had learned to ask a corpsman about cough color before transport summary. Lena answered with the incomplete truth of experience. He told her that answer was incomplete. She told him the question was too. For the first time, the edge of a smile touched his face, not out of amusement but out of recognition of resistance. He moved closer and took in the details, her watch, her posture, the way she remained balanced even at rest, and the chain beneath her scrub collar where the edge of a plain ring caught the light. Then he asked who she had been before Harbor Point, using her full name in a way that acknowledged he already suspected the answer. She replied only that she was a nurse. He studied her for another moment, and then something in her face crossed a threshold inside him. Almost under his breath, with the awe of someone touching the edge of a ghost, he said the call sign again, Harbor. Lena did not flinch, and that confirmed more for him than any explanation could have. Her eyes softened once with the pain of a door she had locked years ago, hearing the old key turn in its frame. She told him he should not say that name there. He admitted that he had thought she was dead. She corrected him by saying she had simply gone away. He told her he had read the after-action summary and then watched the sealed addendum disappear along with her name. She replied that this disappearance had been the point. He recalled the Kandar evacuation, the oil platform in the Gulf, the night extraction under fire and flooding, the communications failures, and the medic who had kept 6 trapped men alive in blackout conditions. He had never seen her face clearly then, only her hands, heard only her voice, and knew only that every time someone began to lose control, she made the world sound smaller. Harbor, he explained, was what they had called her because when everything went wrong, she was the place where people stopped drowning. The fluorescent hum in the room suddenly seemed too loud. Lena looked past him through the glass wall and into some older darkness the hospital could never comprehend. She said only that it had been a long time ago. He answered that it had not been long ago for the men who came home because of her. When she mentioned that one of his chiefs still over-tightened shoulder straps, the last of his uncertainty vanished. He laughed once in stunned relief and told her that it truly was her. In that moment, the moral balance of the night snapped into place. The quiet nurse the hospital had mocked was not inexperienced, timid, or lucky. She was a woman already forged by pressures the floor could barely imagine, and she had chosen silence not because she lacked a story, but because service had never been performance to her. Cade asked why she had come to Harbor Point. Lena explained that her mother now lived in Chula Vista and had needed help after surgery the previous year, so she had come home, or at least to somewhere she had hoped would be quieter. Cade glanced toward the corridor where the hospital clattered around its own ignorance and asked dryly how that was going. Lena answered with the smallest, driest smile. He said the staff had no idea who they were dealing with. Lena agreed. Then his eyes went to the restriction notice lying near her notes, and he observed that the hospital's ignorance was about to become its problem. Lena immediately told him not to turn this into something larger than necessary. He seemed genuinely surprised and asked what she meant. She told him she did not want to be rescued by her past. She had come there to work, not to be carried by what she had once been. The statement struck him hard enough to show. He understood the distinction, but he also understood there was a difference between rescuing someone and refusing to let a lie harden around them. Lena knew he was right. That was what made it difficult. Cade left conference room C without another word, and within minutes Harbor Point's administrative machinery began making a different sound. Not louder, but tighter. The chief nursing officer, Miriam Sloan, arrived from home still wearing a dark coat over scrubs, her hair clipped back with the efficiency of someone who did not enjoy being summoned, but enjoyed unanswered questions even less. She was followed by security, risk management, and a legal liaison who suddenly had time for what Denise had called a routine process review. Denise's expression when Sloan asked for every incident log from the previous 8 hours was a study in the fragility of borrowed authority. Thorne tried charm first and failed. He tried calm certainty next and fared only slightly better. Cade had not barged into rooms or thrown rank around. He had done something far more damaging to weak systems. He had asked precise questions in front of the right people. He asked who had authorized Bell's off-protocol transport to the donor event. He asked at what exact time the medication revision had been entered versus when the line had been hung. He asked why the nurse who identified the discrepancy had been restricted before pharmacy audit. He asked why a staff member had been removed from active trauma response immediately after a second successful intervention involving his chief. He asked how many witnesses were present during each event and whether statements had been taken independently. That word, independently, moved through administration like ice water. Sloan responded as competent senior leaders do when they smell institutional stupidity. She stopped accepting summaries and demanded source material. She wanted raw timestamps, cabinet access logs, overhead call records, room footage where available, and witness statements taken separately rather than in any group where fear could harmonize into fiction. Tessa, when interviewed, told the truth with a precision so fierce it sounded like sharpened steel. The rapid response physician confirmed Lena's early catch in Bell's room. Bell's daughter described Lena as the only person who acted as though her father were a human being instead of a liability. The young corpsman from Team 7 repeated with military simplicity that Nurse Mercer had identified the hidden deterioration in Chief Velez before anyone else in the bay. Gradually, the neat story Harbor Point had started constructing around Lena collapsed under the weight of chronology. Meanwhile, Lena remained in conference room C, because institutions often isolate the most useful people while deciding whether truth is convenient. She did not complain. She kept writing. Tessa slipped in with coffee and reported what was happening outside. Sloan was pulling access logs. Pharmacy had been brought in. Risk management looked miserable. Denise was pretending she had always supported a full review, and Thorne had discovered that confidence sounds different when legal sits nearby. Tessa also made it clear that she had noticed the exchange between Lena and Commander Cade. Lena admitted only that he knew her from before. Tessa accepted the answer reluctantly, understanding that every truth in Lena's life seemed to arrive like classified material. When she said it felt like an expensive habit, Lena admitted quietly that it had been. By late morning, Arthur Bell himself had become an administrative problem. He was stable enough to make calls, rich enough to demand explanations, and angry enough to ignore every patient relations attempt to soothe him. He demanded the name of the nurse who had intervened in his room. When told that a review was underway, he reportedly answered that the person who should be reviewed was the idiot who had nearly let him die. That sentence moved through the hospital floor in under 3 minutes. Thorne heard it, Denise heard it, Lena did not yet. At 10:05, Miriam Sloan convened a formal conference in the larger administration room off the surgical wing. Present were Sloan, Risk Management, Legal, Pharmacy, Security, Denise Kessler, Dr. Malcolm Thorne, Tessa Alvarez as witness, the Rapid Response Physician, one resident from Bell's room, the Team 7 corpsman, and Commander Owen Cade seated at the end of the table with his sling and unreadable comm. Lena was called in last. When she entered, the room turned toward her with that unmistakable tilt that comes from people spending the previous hour discussing someone absent. Sloan opened with the usual institut. Ional language about event review, timeline discrepancies, staff conduct, and patient safety exposure, then began walking through the actual evidence. The medication cabinet logs did not match Thorne's original account. The chart revision time placed the order change after the prior line had already been hung downstairs for Bell's donor appearance. Security footage confirmed Bell had left his unit against recommended protocol following a conversation between Thorne and donor relations. The rapid response timestamp aligned with Lena's intervention rather than showing her action as the cause of the crisis. The resident, sweating through his collar, admitted he had heard Lena warn Thorne before the deterioration accelerated. Pharmacy confirmed that the line mismatch created a foreseeable risk requiring immediate interruption once recognized. When Thorne tried to hide behind the complexity of real-time environments, the pharmacist answered dryly that the situation had not been that nuanced. The silence afterward was catastrophic for him. Once one protected professional loses unanimous cover, people who have been waiting to tell the truth recognize permission. The resident repeated more clearly that Nurse Mercer had raised the concern before the patient worsened and had specifically described the line as being within the wrong range. Sloan wrote it down. Then she turned to the Team 7 corpsman, who confirmed that Lena had identified deterioration in Velez early, had asked the pre-transport indicators that actually mattered, and had improved the room's response by changing its focus. Denise shifted in her chair. Thorne's jaw locked. Lena remained still, not from fear but from old habit. There are moments when moving too much feels like interfering with gravity. Sloan asked Thorne whether he wished to amend any part of his written account in light of the discrepancies. He chose the language of dignity, claiming recollections can differ under stress. No one in legal or risk management came to rescue him. Then Commander Cade spoke and observed that stress does not alter cabinet timestamps. No one in the room was prepared for how devastating a simple sentence could be in the mouth of a man who did not waste them. Thorne tried to dismiss Cade's relevance by pointing out that he had not been present for the Bell incident. Cade answered that he had, however, been present for the pattern. The legal liaison looked down to hide what might have been approval. Sloan then asked Denise why Nurse Mercer's trauma access had been removed in a hallway before formal review. Denise tried to frame it as a discretionary staffing decision meant to de-escalate conflict. Tessa laughed aloud. Sloan did not even look at her. She asked Denise whether it had truly been about conflict or whether it had been about exposure. Denise's color changed, and the point of no return was reached. After a short break for verification, the conference resumed with every trace of institutional cushioning stripped from Sloan's tone. She announced that Lena's restrictions were lifted effective immediately and that the prior action would be removed from her orientation record. When Denise tried to speak, Sloane cut her off with a raised hand and told her she had had enough turns. Then Sloane informed Thorne that his written statement was being referred for formal peer review due to material inconsistency with documented sequence and witness testimony, and that until the review concluded, he was relieved of lead supervisory authority on the floor. When he began protesting, she warned him to choose his next sentence carefully. He did not speak again. Sloane then turned to Denise and ordered a written rationale for the access removal, with policy citation, by the end of the day. Pending review, Denise was removed from unilateral personnel actions on the unit. Her composure cracked along one visible seam. At that moment, to complete the collapse of the false story, the door opened and Belle's daughter entered with patient relations trailing behind her, having ignored every suggestion to remain elsewhere. She looked directly at Lena and identified her as the nurse who had saved her father. "If you want, I can do the next step and turn this into a full 9,000, 10,000 word plain text script with the same tone and no dialogue formatting.